There's another wireless technology on the horizon, private 5G. Everyone's excited about it, but is it really right for your enterprise? In this episode of the Tech Field Day podcast, it's time for private 5G to move into the enterprise. Welcome to the Tech Field Day podcast, where we bring together a group of IT technical experts to discuss a single idea about key concepts in the industry. This podcast features a variety of perspectives from members of the Tech Field Day delegate community and is often recorded in association with one of our events. Tech Field Day is a part of the Futurum Group. On this episode, which we're recording before HPE Discover, we're going to introduce our premise in just a minute after I introduce our guests, starting with Shaun.
Hello, Shaun Neal. I am a director of engineering services for a VAR, and have been part of this Tech Field Day community for a number of years, and just looking forward to another podcast.
All right, thanks, Shaun. And Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Houtz. I'm a network engineer for a bunch of school districts up here in Utah. On the side, I blog and write things, but I'm heavily in the Wi-Fi side as well as the private cellular side. I have a pretty healthy private cellular network that we've been building for about 4 or 5 years now. And yeah, that's kind of who I am.
And I'm Tom Hollingsworth. I'm the event lead for Tech Field Day, focusing on mobility and wireless technologies. Let's jump into the premise for today's episode. As I mentioned, we're recording this ahead of HPE Discover, which is taking place the third week of June in 2024. And one of the exciting things is this integration that we've seen between HPE Aruba Networking and HPE proper. And one of the big acquisitions that happened last year was the purchase of Athonet, which is a private 5G company that has been doing a lot of deployments. And it really has bolstered the connectivity options at the intelligent edge that HPE Aruba Networking has to offer. But there's been some delay in getting private 5G into the enterprise. So in this podcast, we'd like to debate the premise that it's time for private 5G to move into the enterprise. Now, I want to take a moment to kind of discuss this acquisition by HPE Aruba Networking of Athonet, because there was a little bit of a discussion in the community around picking them up, because I know that they had partnered with some companies in the past, and there was, questions about what bringing it in-house would actually mean. And even in that year, we've seen some moves and changes and even some announcements here recently about the service that they're going to be offering. So I was wondering if I could toss this out to you guys. Maybe you could give us a little bit of background detail on why HP Aruba Networking wanted to pick up Athonet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one, as we look at what's going on out in the wireless space and the sort of the struggle for spectrum that exists, I think, where a lot of this private 5G started was, finding a way to gain additional spectrum. A lot of this process started before the 6 gigahertz spectrum was really ready or even made available. So, a piece of that, I think, has maybe been alleviated somewhat, right? But we're always looking for more spectrum for more different devices. And I think it's kind of started in sort of some niche use cases, where sort of critical low latency networking needed to be in its own space.
Yeah, exactly. Ultimately, private 5G, private LTE is where this started. It's been around for a long time. And enterprises have been able to purchase spectrum, been able to stand up their own LTE networks for years. But what really changed is the release of spectrum, as you talked about, Shaun, the CBRS band specifically here in the United States, that has kind of helped push this along to where it's a more of a viable network that anybody could stand up a network and build one of these networks to provide coverage. One of the issues we're running into is use cases. And so there's been a lot of people exploring that. And at this point, with the Athonet acquisition, HP must be seeing that there's some use cases out there that make this worth it, and are pursuing those use cases.
I want to talk about that for just a minute, because one of the things that has always kind of been a contention point is this idea that what do I need to have a private 5G network to cover that I can't already cover with Wi-Fi? Because I mean, let's be fair, Wi-Fi is a pretty mature technology at this point when you think about it. Granted, we're always doing these leaps of technology innovation with 6 gigahertz and now with Wi-Fi 7 around the corner, but what is it about the CBRS, private 5G, private LTE radio makeup that makes it more suited for certain environments? What are the kinds of places that you would expect to see this deployed over Wi-Fi?
John Deere, a couple weeks ago, had a press release or some release where they actually said that Wi-Fi is legacy. I don't agree with that. I know a lot of people that listen to this podcast are going to pull out their pitchforks and kind of disagree with that. Wi-Fi is not going away. There's been this kind of 5G is going to take over Wi-Fi world. That's not happening. They're complementary. Where cellular works is largely where we're finding is in a lot of the uncarpeted spaces, manufacturing, outdoors, in large areas where providing Wi-Fi APs at the low level power levels that they provide are difficult to install. You have to have a lot of them in an area. Private 5G can cover larger distances because of the higher power rates and how the technology is built. It's built to go distances versus Wi-Fi is more of within a room or a couple rooms area. Private 5G and LTE really excels in reaching those larger areas.
Yeah, and as we kind of mentioned in the opener too, I think some of the areas where we were seeing it were those use cases where I'd say, when we think about like traditional Wi-Fi, a lot of times we end up building for environments or a sort of a series of compromises, right? Because you're trading off like max performance versus lowest common denominator device, right? And sort of having to sort of hash that out, right? And I think there's a lot of some of these use cases that first started coming up with a private 5G would be like manufacturing and robots, for instance, right? That are very, very sensitive to latency. Human safety could be an issue if there's a disruption. And so, the other piece that we're getting in the private 5G is we're getting a lot of the controls that are available in the sort of the carrier world, and have started to make it with the newer versions of Wi-Fi, but haven't fully been realized in the Wi-Fi space yet. Even though the standards are now starting to support that stuff, it hasn't been fully adopted. And I think some of that is because of trade-offs that we have to make, and so where we saw this start were these purpose-built networks for one or two very initial use cases. But I do think companies have heartburn over that, right? It is a separate wireless network for one use case, and that can be a hard sell.
So we've obviously talked about why it's important to use a private 5G network over Wi-Fi, where the advantages are and things like that. But let's turn that script on the other side of it. Why would I want to use a private 5G or CBRS network as opposed to just using what is there available today through any one of a number of providers? What advantages do I get for using CBRS over AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, etc.?
If you have requirements for control of data, that's where we're finding a lot of interest in using a private cellular network. If you want full end-to-end control of your network, private 5G is the only way to go. If you have data requirements, federal government or different things like that, they do not want data out on public clouds. They want to keep it within the public cloud or within their private network. That is where a lot of this expectation of security is being used. Private cellular is being used to provide security in those situations.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, Mark, I would say, with the private 5G SIMs and things too, right? So not only is it sort of a little hardware component that could be in your phone, right? Or an eSIM, as we've seen, right? There's some eSIMs out there. that but being able to have those types of connections and not necessarily have to pay a public provider, right? I mean, you're going to have it in house, and if that's all you need, that's an option now, right? And they don't have to carry a full carrier line that could be taken out of facility and be serviceable.
Additionally, a lot of the carrier networks, they don't penetrate buildings the greatest. Um, Private cellular uses what's called small cell technology, and so more on the Wi-Fi side. So indoors, there's some locations that are looking at it to provide coverage to their users in locations where Wi-Fi is not possible, but indoors in situations like that. So
That makes sense when you think about it, because a lot of companies are trying to look at alternatives for that, because while companies have a large workforce that are using cell phones, they still have to have other connectivity options. I still remember a time when we were hoping to hop on the ATT Wi-Fi network because 3G was completely overloaded with people and iPhones when they first came out. But I want to go back to this idea of the uncarpeted enterprise, because I think a lot of people have this perception, if you will, that the enterprise is a very clean office with rows of cubicles and drop ceilings and fluorescent lights. And we'll just put, a few APs around here wherever the coverage map says I need to put them. And that takes care of that. But as you've kind of talked about, it's hard to do that in a manufacturing floor or in a stadium or in a place where the lines are not as clean. What is it about an uncarpeted enterprise, other than the power levels, which we've already talked about, that is just not conducive to using Wi-Fi technologies?
We did talk about the use cases, and Mark did talk about some of the distance, sort of the distance requirements and things that come into play. I mentioned lately about some of the controls. I think those really are a big piece of it. The latency controls, the controls over signaling, and which device can talk and when, and better controls over quality of service for certain types of applications. Right. I think some of that doesn't exist or isn't quite where it is implemented. The controls aren't as good as what we have in the private Wi-Fi or private 5G realm. So I think sort of dialing in the support for the specific applications. I feel is definitely one of the areas that it can shine.
private 5G is more AP controlled. Wi-Fi is absolutely controlled by the client. Clients choose when to talk. They have the back off timer, getting super technical here, but you have a back off timer where a client will try to talk. If they hear collisions, they will back off and wait. Private 5G and LTE technologies are built differently in that regard. The radio breaks up the spectrum into chunks and says, "Okay, this is your chunk. Talk here." And that is how we achieve a lot of that latency. Is we are able to dedicate resource units in the technical term, but we're able to dedicate resources to individual radios, and that device is allowed to talk. So we're able to prioritize certain traffic over other traffic in a much more efficient manner than Wi-Fi is able to do now. And so that provides a lot of efficiencies for these robots, these manufacturing plants, and these locations where those are paramount, that we need that latency, we need the data to arrive on time at the expected moment. That is, private 5G and private LTE provide that right now, whereas Wi-Fi is promised, but it's never fully been delivered because of how the technologies are built.
So I want to talk for a moment dollars and cents, because unfortunately, all of the technological solutions in the world, no matter how pristine and great they can be, are eventually going to come up against a blocker. In most cases, it's the investment cost to deploy them. And I know that a lot of companies look at Wi-Fi as just kind of an additive cost thing. Oh, don't worry about that. We'll just order a few more APs and you guys can figure out where to put them and it'll cover everything. But I feel like private 5G requires a little bit more investment. What kinds of numbers are we looking at roughly? And is it something that companies can budget for without an obscene amount of uplift in order to get to a point where they can provide way better coverage for a reasonable amount of money?
I think today it's fairly comparable. I think you're looking at the average footprint of a private LTE style. I'll call it an access point, a radio. Tends to have a larger footprint than your standard Wi-Fi coverage would have, but the price is higher. So like that tends to be, maybe a little bit of a wash there in terms of in cost, and then the back end is somewhat similar. It does feel like a lot of enterprises are basically installing two full enterprise wireless networks today. One for the traditional Wi-Fi use cases, and another for the private, LTE use cases. And boy, would it be nice to see those two converge into one sort of dashboard, one back end management plane, those types of things, because those are a lot of things that are different today. And having two of them, is more management overhead, it's more support, there's more everything.
That is one of the hopes of this HPE Aruba acquisition. Now HPE, or not Aruba, Athonet, or HPE Athonet acquisition, is that we can start to bring these technologies together into one system instead of having multiple systems, multiple networks. Hopefully someday we will get there. So going back to the original question, with pricing, indoors, you're installing these about 4 radios per Wi-Fi, 4 Wi-Fi APs per private cellular radio, 4 to 8, somewhere in there, depending upon the space. Outdoors, your costs skyrocket when you're trying to install Wi-Fi in these locations. You're having to run fiber. You're having to mount Wi-Fi radios in locations because there is that lower power. With private 5G, you stick up a single radio and suddenly you're covering the area of 20, 40, 50 APs with one radio. And so the outdoor costs absolutely they are more expensive to get an outdoor radio, but at the end of the day, you're spending less on equipment, less overhead, less other things than just the radio, because you're only putting out one or two radios.
Yeah, in the space you're talking about, the outdoor space, right? I mean, a lot of the cost is getting that radio to where I want it to be physically to support Wi-Fi, right? So like, especially you look at some interesting use cases like how harbors work, or train yards, or some of those that are like outdoor large industrial spaces. Wi-Fi is very difficult and mesh is very difficult, right? And so I think this is a place that there are some really interesting use cases, right? And again, in those, some of the targets are moving targets, right? They are vehicles that pick up a train car off of a semi truck and then move it to be loaded onto a ship, right? Like those, that's a large space. I mean, many football fields worth of space that need coverage, and Wi-Fi just can't do that today.
It also comes down to I'm going to say a word that's different in which technology you're talking about, but roaming. In the Wi-Fi world, roaming is moving between AP to AP. In the cellular world, it means something different. It means moving from carrier to carrier. It's called handoff in the cellular world. But on Wi-Fi, that handoff introduces a lot of latency. In the cellular world, because we have larger cells, these coverage areas are much larger. That handoff is a lot more efficient, as well as the technology is built to handle a lot more efficiently than Wi-Fi. And so as you're moving from in the warehouse to out to the dock to the ship, you could be potentially moving from private cellular network to private cellular network, but that handoff is seamless. The data drops at WLPC this last year. Your drop data it's at most 1 or 2 packets at most. Most of the time it's actually even less than, it's none. It's just a quick drop off. Whereas Wi-Fi, they have to suddenly drop, go search for a new AP, and there can be several drop packets. Whereas with private cellular, that is just handled by the core. It says, okay, move over to here to this other radio. Your signal's better over here, move there, and it moves, and it's all controlled.
That does sound like something a lot of people may want in their network. But as we sit here in summer of 2024, it's important to make sure that we're asking the right questions if we're faced with a technology refresh or a special project that requires us to do that. So if you're talking to a client who's saying that maybe they need to investigate this, what is one question that they need to ask of their providers or their suppliers to make sure that private 5G is the right fit for what they're trying to accomplish?
What's the use cases? At the end of the day, what use case are you trying to solve? What is the struggle with Wi-Fi? I've looked at some where there was problems with Wi-Fi. We were able to fix the Wi-Fi and actually fix the issue. We didn't need to go private cellular. But at the same time, there's locations where Wi-Fi struggles, private cellular exceeds. And so it really comes down to use case. What is your use case? What are you trying to accomplish? Does it fit certain criteria that private cellular helps with versus Wi-Fi? Maybe Wi-Fi may be better, but at the end of the day, it comes down to use cases.
Yeah, I think it's also a little confusing for a lot of the companies that are trying to consume this, or at least hear about it and are interested in learning more, because there's also sort of what it isn't, right? And I think when people think of private cellular, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is, great, I don't need a DAS anymore, right? I don't need, and like everybody always asks, well, can we just put our cell phones on this? Can my, I live here in Las Vegas where these conferences are, can this, private 5G solution replace AT&T and Verizon or T-Mobile in these buildings? And the answer is no currently, right? Like, I think, there's been a lot of tries in that space as well, and that it'd be an interesting evolution to see if it becomes a little more ubiquitous in terms of roaming from a Wi-Fi to a private 5G to a true cellular network, and somewhere in the middle. I know that's what people would want. We're definitely not there.
Well, as you can see from this conversation, the private 5G technology is ready for the enterprise today, but only if you have the right use case for it. Wi-Fi is a mature technology, and it is ubiquitous in its deployment from a client device perspective. But not all devices are Wi-Fi devices. Some things need to have a little bit more reliability or need to have more assurance. Some things need to be covered that are not your typical cubicle row. It could be a port, it could be a stadium, it could be a warehouse. Whatever the case may be, you need to make sure that you're asking the right questions of your providers and providing them with all the information about your use case. Don't just deploy this technology because it looks cool. You need to make sure you're making the right decision for your environment so that you can be sure that private 5G is ready for your enterprise. That'll do it for this episode of the Tech Field Day podcast. I want to thank our guests for joining us. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in. Don't forget that you can always find the latest episode of this podcast by heading to our website at techfieldday.com/podcast. You can subscribe to us in your favorite podcatcher. Just look for the Tech Field Day podcast, and you can find us on Spotify. If you have any other questions, please make sure you submit them to us. We're at Tech Field Day on most social media platforms, and we would love to answer them. And we will be back next week with another great episode. Until then, take care, and thanks for listening.